Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Without Britain, France alone in Europe would bear the nuclear burden.
Solution table sur F5.
The French stockpile is 50% bigger than Britain's, and whereas Britain now only has the Trident system, France keeps air-launched nuclear weapons as well as similar submarines. So why not leave the French to it? Well, talk to decision-makers from other NATO countries, and they're not that keen on Britain renouncing its nuclear weapons. Even France, in the recent past, has shown interest in joint submarine patrol plans or developing new air-launched weapons with the UK. Leaders in Germany or the countries of Eastern Europe tend to give strong support to the idea of Britain retaining a central role in European defence with nuclear weapons. And recent examples of nuclear sabre-rattling by President Putin have just confirmed them in that view.
This year, our nuclear forces will get more than 40 new intercontinental ballistic missiles, which are capable of overcoming any anti-missile systems, even the most technically advanced.
Underlying much of this debate is an uncertainty in Europe as to whether they could really stand up to their eastern neighbour and whether the United States might abandon them in an hour of crisis.
Well, let's talk now about security. Joining me now are Radek Sikorski, the former Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs in Donald Tusk's cabinet, before that National Defence Minister. Major General Patrick Cordingley, commander of the 7th Armoured Brigade of UK troops in the First Gulf War, and Professor Malcolm Chalmers, director of the Nuclear Policy Programme at the Royal United Institute. And in Florida is Nancy Soderberg, former US Ambassador to the United Nations and Foreign Policy Advisor to the Clinton administration. Good evening to you all. Radek Sikorski, it's a Cold War weapon for a Cold War that doesn't exist anymore, Trident.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because when I was Defence Minister, I declassified some of our Polish Warsaw Pact era exercise maps, and they envisaged a Warsaw Pact invasion of Western Europe and Soviet nuclear strikes on Germany, on Denmark, on Holland, but significantly not on France and not on the UK. Why do you think that was?
So they wouldn't think that actually we would come to their aid. That's a bit of a worry.
Well, I think the Soviets made calculations which I think are confirmed by what has happened ever since. Countries actually have given up nuclear weapons. South Africa was mentioned, but also, most significantly, Ukraine. Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world in exchange for guarantees of its territorial integrity, and we know what's happened to that.
But you talked about declassifying documents from Warsaw Pact era. But what do you think now? Do you think that Vladimir Putin, we know he's beefing up his nuclear arsenal, is he a threat to the West?
Russia has a doctrine of the first use of nuclear weapons. This was from a time when Russia felt conventionally weaker, and Russia exercises using battlefield weapons in a confrontation with NATO. Zapad 2009 exercise, Zapad 2013. Vladimir Putin talks about using nuclear weapons. If he talks about it, it means he thinks about it.
Nancy Soderberg, do you agree with that rather chilling statement that if Vladimir Putin is thinking about nuclear weapons, he'll be thinking about using nuclear weapons, and he'll more likely use them against us if we do not have our own Trident missiles?
Well, first of all, I think you have to recognize that we all have plans to use nuclear weapons. I can conceive of no conceivable realistic situation in which they would use. Our own intelligence says the threat we really have from a nuclear weapon would be a terrorist getting components of it. That argues that less nuclear material out there is better. We in the US have been trying to reduce our numbers, and I think the debate in Britain about the Trident submarine is not likely to change. The politics aren't quite there for there yet. But in terms of the longer term, the U.S. has a very vibrant nuclear umbrella over Europe, and the Trident missiles really serves as a symbolic but not military significant
That's interesting.
addition to that.
It's interesting. It's symbolic. That's interesting. Do you think we could rely on the U.S. to the same extent that we do now if we did not
Absolutely.
have Trident? If we did not have Trident?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Britain is not going to get rid of its 4 Trident submarines anytime soon. They will be upgraded. But you have to recognize only one of them is circulating around at any time. And I think there's a total of 16 weapons, is what the press says, is on there. So it's not a massive retaliatory force. But the larger picture here is the world is moving towards reducing its nuclear weapons. The more countries that have nuclear weapons, the harder it is to convince Iran that it doesn't need one. Right now, there are 9 of them. Iran might be the 10th if our nuclear deal falls apart. But over time, I think the Britons, maybe not this cycle, but within the next 10 to 20 years, I think these weapons will be phased out. There's a lively debate here in the United States of why do we have tactical nuclear weapons there, too.
Let me put that to Mark and Jack. So Nancy Soderbergh's view is that really our contribution to the arsenal is symbolic rather than anything else, and it will be phased out. And actually, America would still come to our aid if we didn't have weapons.
Well, I think it's most unlikely that the UK arsenal will be phased out, except in the context of multilateral disarmament. The idea we're going to do that unilaterally it would be a very radical step to take, and I see no evidence we're about to take that step.
I would agree with that. No one's talking about unilaterally doing it all. It would have to be negotiated over time.
Patrick, accordingly, if we were to give up our weapon, we'd be the first country in the world, in the NATO, to give up our weapons. Obviously, we know about Brazil, we know about South Africa, we know about Ukraine. What impact would that have on our standing in the world?
Well, could I just come back to whether if it is symbolic? Let's assume that deterrence has worked. I wouldn't necessarily agree it has, but let's assume it has. Why? It's because America has got an enormous arsenal, 4,500, 1,500 ready nuclear warheads ready to be used. We've got 48 at any one time. It's a pinprick. And actually, as you heard, if we got rid of those, it would have no effect on deterrence against Russia at all. Russia would still be deterred. I believe in NATO, and therefore we are perfectly safe under the American umbrella. That is the standpoint that I come from.
And on that basis, you think scrap?
Yes, and what America really wants us to do, and I know this is controversial, it wants us to up our conventional weapons. At the moment,
exactly
we really are going very, very close to actually being an ineffective armed force because we're just too small.
Do we have kind of extra power, do you think, in the whole diplomatic sphere because we have nuclear weapons?
I think the more important question to ask is, if the UK, having been involved in this business for more than 60 years, from the Manhattan Project in the 1940s, was to decide now to get rid of the whole system, the first thing people would ask in Russia, in America, wherever is, why have we made such a radical change in our policy? And those in this country who are most opposed to nuclear weapons are doing it to our nuclear weapons are not doing it because they're particularly trusting of the Americans or they want to up our conventional defences. They're doing it primarily for moral reasons because they think these weapons are morally repugnant.
But I wonder why we would have still, or if we would indeed have a permanent seat in the Security Council if we gave up our nuclear weapons. Our power in the world, according to Michael Fallon, would be diminished. Our standing in the world would be diminished. Why should we have a permanent seat?
I think if the United Nations and the Security Council were being designed today, the membership would be different.
Yeah.
The European Union would perhaps be entitled to a seat, but not its member states, and it would certainly have some other big countries like India and others. So yes, but you know, that's history.
What do you make of this idea that actually what the Americans really want us to do is up our conventional warfare? They'll take care of nuclear. They want Britain to be able to fight a more conventional war.
Well, that's like asking yourself whether you need a tank or a plane. You need both. We need to deter potential enemies at all stages, at all levels.
Could I come in the UN Security Council? Because we became a permanent member of the UN Security Council before we had nuclear weapons. And there are multiple reasons why we can justify having a seat now with second largest aid budget in the world, fourth largest defence budget, maybe the sixth or seventh largest economy, and one of 2 European Union members. So nuclear weapons are not the main reason we're on the Security Council.
But surely the argument is that if somebody does on the UN Security Council give up nuclear weapons, it sends an enormous message to everybody that actually was serious about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And why not make an example? We don't need them, as I pointed out. Why not make an example to the world?
Well, Nancy Soderberg, what do you think Vladimir Putin's response would be if indeed Britain gave up its nuclear weapons? Do you think he would be emboldened? Do you think that we would be more vulnerable?
I don't think that there's any chance that Vladimir Putin, even if he keeps his downrolled tyrannical slide, is going to seriously contemplate using nuclear weapons in Europe. There's no reason, there's no threat. And I think I'll just go back to the earlier point on the conventional side, that it's not like having one weapon or another. It's what do we need right now in the world? We need help with fighting ISIS. We need more British. The British are our best allies. They're our best partners in the battlefield. We need more help now on the current fights with ISIS, the Air Force, the intelligence, the drones, trying to fight the threat of terrorism. And so I think the debate about whether to get rid of Britain's nuclear arsenal is not going to be a huge shock outside of Britain, quite honestly. No one's saying it would be, no one's saying anybody will do any of this unilaterally. You've also got the French there.
Yep.
But I think increasingly the threat is, could terrorists get a hold of the loose nukes, the loose materials? And the answer is yes. And when the less nuclear material that's out there, that would be a very powerful signal to move forward. And I think Britain is not there now. It's debating it, but it's clear the votes are not there to change it.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all we have time for tonight. That's it for now.